Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I'm your host. Today in the studio, we have John Teakell. Now, John Teakell has a legal office in Dallas, Texas. He's a criminal defense attorney who successfully defended hundreds of individuals charged with Texas felonies and federal felony offenses. After 15 years of criminal defense and securities prosecution work, as a former state and federal prosecutor, John Teakell established the law office of John R. Teakell, a criminal defense law firm located in Dallas, Texas. The National Trial Lawyers Association recognizes John Teakell as a top-rated criminal defense attorney in Texas, as well as a Texas super lawyer. Teakell has also been selected for several honors, including the National Association of Distinguished Counsel's Top 1%, Lawyers of Distinction, Best Attorneys of America, and the Global Who's Who Top Attorney. He was highlighted in Forbes magazine, in Time magazine, and chosen to be the Expert Network's Distinguished Lawyer. Welcome, John Teakell, to the show.
Thank you, Judge. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. Let's tell the folks how you and I came in contact with each other.
Well, as you've indicated, I've been in private practice for a number of years now since I left the government, and I am continuing to go down this track of federal criminal defense, state criminal defense. My immediate people had contacted you, and here we are.
I appreciate you coming on. You're definitely adding some rich experience to the show. Let's talk a little bit about you, who you are, your personal experience working as a state and federal prosecutor, and then later transitioning to become a private criminal defense practitioner.
Sure. As you indicated, as a young attorney, I was an assistant DA, state prosecutor for a handful of years, went on to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is what I aspired to do. Thought I was going to be a career prosecutor for a lot of years till I got into my 40s. And by that time, I had done a lot of white-collar federal cases. Actually, when I was in the Northern District of Texas in the U.S. Attorney's Office, after probably about 10 years of being an assistant U.S. attorney there, I was recruited along with some other assistant U.S. attorneys around the country to go to the District of Puerto Rico to help out with their backlog of cases. Of course, it's a U.S. territory. There's a big federal presence, which keeps the island safe, I should say, or safe as can be. It was and is a real trafficking point from South America, some from Central America for powder cocaine, which resulted in large drug trafficking cases, very large money laundering cases. There were shootings, killings between different factions, killing of government witnesses. So therefore, there were a lot of federal death penalty eligible cases, and some that actually were approved for such. So after doing that, I was there for about 3 years, spent a couple of years at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Miami as a trial attorney, and 2.5 years there, came back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, came back to Dallas to start the law office, and I've been focusing on criminal defense for about 20 years.
Wow. What law school did you go to?
I applied to law schools that had night programs only at that time because I knew I had to work and support myself. So at that time, for example, SMU didn't have a night program. I went to Oklahoma City University. I had a job there during the oil boom back in the early 80s with a large bank downtown. So worked out well as far as getting a job and going to school there.
Sometimes folks ask, is there a certain degree that you have to go to law school? And I always tell them, it doesn't matter what it is as long as you have a bachelor's degree. What was your undergraduate degree in?
My undergraduate degree actually was in agriculture and animal science when back then we didn't have the internet and what have you. And given my background, I thought I wanted to be a a horse veterinarian and hopefully work at some of the high dollar horse places.
Wow.
Learned about other stuff out there, changed direction after undergraduate, and here we are.
How hard was it to go to law school and work at the same time?
It was kind of a drag, really, but getting over to law school at, starting at 6 or so every evening right after work, trying to get there on time, but going through the motions and trying to work, as you know, trying to work toward taking the bar exam one day. So it was a grind, but it is for everybody in a way.
It was challenging. When I was in law school, we had to sign some document that we weren't going to work that first year. And of course, I had to do the same. I had a family that I was supporting. But looking back, you see why they want you to sign that, but life has to continue, right?
That's right.
So you talked about a state prosecutor working as an assistant DA. What kind of work did you do there?
Just all kind of state crimes, but then the last couple of years I focused on drug cases. And you know how it is in the DA's office. It's more of there's a lot of what I would call street crime. And then of course you have murders, you have some theft cases, you have stolen credit cards, deception type cases, some false statement type cases, but just a variety of state prosecutions, prostitution. But I had focused on drug cases the last couple of years.
For those that don't really know the differences, we do live in a system of justice that is a two-court system. There is a federal court system. There is also state court system that has 51 different types of systems within that particular system. What's the differences? How would you explain what it's like to prosecute in both? I've never been a federal prosecutor, so I myself don't really understand exactly what those distinctions are.
Well, basically, the difference is in federal court, you're dealing with cases where you have quote unquote federal jurisdiction. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about mail fraud, wire fraud as an example, and those are staples as far as charges in the U.S. Attorney's Office. So there's nothing magical about them except that if there's fraudulent activity or a fraud scheme, and say the U.S. mail or even now common carriers are used to facilitate the scheme, then there's your mail fraud, at least as a charge. Same thing on wire fraud. It used to be use of radio waves, TV signals. It's more and more just turned into online use, email uses, text, things like that. If that was used to facilitate the scheme, then that gives a basis to charge federally wire fraud. So those are examples. And to more fully answer your question, federal court, usually the cases are, on the whole, take longer to investigate, take more resources. You may have losses, say, in a fraud scheme that are in the millions of dollars or $1 million or more, or millions of dollars. You have large drug trafficking cases. You have computer intrusions that can be situations where damages were sustained pretty heavily. And then you have some cases that could go federal or state either way. For example, a drug case, if it's sizable at all, chances are it'll go federal. Another example would be, say, counterfeit goods. So if there's a couple of different ways that can be charged in the state, but then there's some specific statutes federally that charge those. But if they're large enough, say a large enough group, large enough conspiracy, the dollar amounts are large enough, then chances are it may go to the federal court.
And sometimes the same act can raise jurisdictional issues in each separate system, right? And I'll give you a quick little example. Let's say somebody walks into a bank. They pull out a gun and they rob the bank teller. That's an aggravated robbery in the state system, and that carries with it a range of punishment. However, because that is an FDIC institution, federally insured, then the federal government can bring charges probably against somebody for stealing from a federally insured corporation.
That's correct. That's a very good example because, as you know, Judge, somebody's arrested. Often they're booked in on state charges in the beginning to hold them, to just keep them in place or get charges against them or get them on bond. And then people are trying to decide if the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to take it or not. And in this case, it's quite likely then they would accept a bank robbery charge, and probably bank robbery, maybe a weapons charge along with it. And here you go.
And what's interesting there is if somebody commits a certain act and that act is a violation of a state statute and a federal statute, that person can be tried in one of those jurisdictions. Let's say they're found to be not guilty. double jeopardy issues would not apply if that person is in charge in the other system. Certain people, they talk about, well, that's a double jeopardy issue, but because we have two separate systems, that's not something that would apply in that situation.
Yeah, that's correct. And I've seen those situations like you have, I'm sure. And a lot of times it's also a function of, well, you have a federal statute that reads just about the same way as a state statute, except you have X added for federal jurisdiction, or maybe the elements are slightly different. So therefore you have technically a different crime because you have different elements.
And what's interesting to me too, right, is as a state prosecutor, you got to work closely with local law enforcement. You got to work with the local police departments, with the sheriff, constables, whereas as a federal prosecutor, you're working on a different level of law enforcement officer. You're working with the FBI, with the CIA, those types of agencies. What's it like to work between the two systems related to dealing with those law enforcement agencies?
My experience has been that although at the state level you do work with the officers and the local police and local officials like you're talking about, on the long term, say you have a longer investigation, often you'll see where the agents come in and they're involving the U.S. Attorney's Office ahead of time or very early on in the investigation to get advice as to whether or not the U.S. Attorney would accept this, if this is going to go forward, and then keeping U.S. Attorney abreast along the way and working together with it. Whereas sometimes at the local level, they may not have the time to do that because the scenario or situation they're working for, it may be more of a reactive situation that something that's happened and they have to move or go do a surveillance or what have you.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that state courts have something like 100 times more cases on the criminal side than federal courts do. When I was a prosecutor and it was time for me to leave the DA's office and open up my own practice, I remember going to my boss. I remember going to the first assistant DA, telling him it's going to be difficult for me, I think, to transition from being a prosecutor to work for the defense. He laughed, put his arm around me, said, "Ron, don't you worry. You really do the exact same thing." What are your thoughts as related to that? What was that transition like for you? And do you really kind of do the same thing?
I would not have said you do the exact same thing. Although you could probably change that wording to you're working with the same group of people or the same system, something like that. The transition for me, I think for a lot of people, was that it took me about a year and a half to get in the true mindset that I'm a defense attorney now, as opposed to being a prosecutor. Because as I said before, I'd been a prosecutor for years, and then I had thought, for a while I was going to be a career prosecutor. But I got to the point, I remember reading early on when I was new to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I was reading about, I don't know, some publication within the DOJ that they put out a couple of times about assistant U.S. attorneys who, were probably 15 or so years older than me, who both had said independently when they left the office, the reason they left, they got to the point where they felt like it was time to move on. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I guess maybe that was their long-term thought process, because still then I was thinking, yeah, wow, this is a great job. I like it, really like it. Probably be here from now on, because I knew some people who were older than me who had done that. But then as I said, I got into my probably early to mid 40s, and I just thought more and more, if I don't make the jump pretty soon, I probably never will. So I ended up doing that. I actually kind of got to the point where I thought it's time to move on. And I was thankful, grateful, because I did get to experience a lot of interesting, large, unique cases. As you know, Judge, you have some murder cases, murder charges. You've probably been involved at the prosecution level. Most of those are done at the state level. In a unique situation federally, there are some that are death penalty eligible. They have to be approved by the Attorney General for you to proceed. I actually had several that were there's a lot that are death penalty eligible, when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Puerto Rico. I actually had 3, I think, when I was there, who actually were approved for it. We went through the specific process. So there were some interesting cases I I'd gotten to do and done a lot of things. So I got to the point where I thought it was time to make a move and took the adventure.
The pandemic changed a lot of things for each of us in society. For me, I'd never really watched TV much. And then the pandemic came around and I learned how to watch TV. So I got into series. I really like watching those types of series that deal with some of the things that you were talking about. Currently, I'm watching a series called Griselda, which is about a cocaine trafficker from Colombia on Netflix. Is it like you see on TV with the trafficking and the murder and all that kind of stuff?
Generally speaking, I find that the reality is not quite like you see on TV. There's a couple of TV programs, series that I've seen. One in particular I'm thinking of that I've seen a little bit, and they were probably hit their height of popularity a few years ago. And there was one, maybe two, that I thought this was about the most realistic I've seen. And to me, the ones that were not realistic, movies and TV, regular TV series themselves, both were on TV. A lot of times, everything is a real drama. Everything's a drama. But in real life, sometimes it's just more matter of fact. You get through a docket, attorneys aren't yelling at each other or every defendant is not crying, and every moment is not so dramatic. So that's a difference you see sometimes. You do see occasionally some of the large traffickers or trafficking organizations, and you get into some interesting scenarios. You see it here in Texas. I saw it in Puerto Rico. I understand it's basically still happening there, where you have some mean folks in serious situations. I think that's probably going to be around for wherever we are.
You talked about, as a federal prosecutor, you talked about white collar crimes and as a defense attorney. And white collar crimes are different than what we consider to be the typical street crimes, especially in state court. Street crimes, you think of murder, aggravated robbery, aggravated sexual assault, arson, those aggravated kidnapping. The trial that we're in the middle of now involves a kidnapping case as well as a murder case. What's the difference between those kind of crimes and working a white collar crime?
Well, there's a couple of differences that come to my mind right away. One is the fact that sometimes those investigations, which would culminate in or result in actual charges against people, often take quite a while, may take months. It's not unusual for something like a bank fraud scheme, an insurance fraud scheme, securities fraud, conspiracy, what have you, to take 2 years or longer to fully investigate. You have a lot of people involved, so you have sometimes an incredible amount of transactions and people and layers to get through to determine really who's involved, what they did, and you might be able to determine here's a core of misrepresentations. But then the question is, well, who all was backing this? Who all knew it? You had different people that were recruited. Did they know it? Were they just someone that was used? Those kind of things.
What we're seeing a lot more in courts related to the street crimes, we're seeing a lot more videos, things like ring videos on the sides of buildings, officer body cams when they approach individuals. See a lot of, testimony from experts, like medical experts, talk about the cause and manner of death. We have some cell phone technology experts that are coming in a lot now, sort of looking at where a cell phone was at different points in time. A white collar case obviously is more paper intensive. You're dealing with records. How would you specifically define for listeners what a white collar case is?
You're correct. It encompasses a lot of different kind of things. I'd say a white collar case is inherently, they're nonviolent, and they're using some method of deception, some misrepresentations of fact, some fraud to usually obtain money, or to deceive in some manner to gain an advantage. That includes, like we were talking about a moment ago, all kind of fraud schemes, an insurance fraud scheme, a bank fraud scheme. It can include manipulation of stock, pulling forward revenue too early on a company financials to try to increase stock value or keep the company afloat when they're really maybe in trouble financially. Just a variety of things. It also includes today computer fraud or exceeding your authority to get into a computer network.
Right. Or situations like somebody is supposed to pay a mortgage company, they get some sort of bad email and then send a down payment to some fraudulent person, romance schemes on the internet, those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, you do. And the other thing that comes to my mind when you're talking about this is, the use of computers and online that's changed not only what you spoke about a moment ago, but it has changed things white collar wise as far as seeing not only actual computer intrusion type charges federally, usually federally, but also facilitating identity theft, aggravated identity theft, just being somebody else online. It's also facilitating and I hate to use this phrase kind of upgrading, or I guess amping up traditional schemes that you've seen to some degree, but they're a lot they're on steroids now. For the one that comes to my mind is you're seeing a resurgence of the refund fraud scheme, where it's done online, so refunds are given quicker before the company can realize that they've been deceived. I mean, for example, you're seeing federally some prosecutions of that where people claim on a wholesale basis they didn't receive a product, and then they'll purposely order electronics or something like that that's at least hundreds of dollars, and you do that over a year or two, you're getting into billions of dollars of loss for these companies. They'll claim that they didn't receive a product, use either stolen cards, or recruit other people to use their names and cards, buy the product, are going to claim a refund saying they didn't get it when they actually got it. And then online they get a refund. And then those companies that do require them to send the product back before they get the refund. If they claim it's damaged instead of never received, they'll send them an empty box, and then they scan the code when they receive it, and it may not be days later until the company realizes, oh gosh, they didn't send us back anything. So you're seeing the use of online for all those kind of things as examples of what's facilitating and just kind of amping it up.
Yeah, the advances in technology has really seemed to provide fodder for those that have a criminal intent, right? John, I'm enjoying this conversation. Let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome to the Q&A break. We have a question. Why do death penalty trials take so long to come about? How would you answer that?
I would say that the trial itself, the core of the trial, as far as a person, whether the person is guilty or not, may not take any longer than any other trial. But then because of the circumstances that led to the fact that there's a death penalty that's being sought by the prosecution, it probably will take a little longer because they're probably introducing forensics and things that would be the basis for seeking the death penalty in a punishment phase. And then you have the punishment phase, of course, as you know, Judge, if the person, this is in state court, if the person is found guilty, and then determining what the punishment should be. And if it's a death penalty, then you have that process, as you well know, having the decision as to what verdict would be.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. On the state court side, if somebody is found guilty of a capital case, a capital murder, there are only two potential punishments. It will either be life in prison without parole, or somebody will get the death penalty. Now, those two results are obviously very drastic. So as a result of that, there are a lot of checks that come into play. For instance, prosecutors generally take close to a year, if not more, to make a determination as to whether they believe that the facts and circumstances of an individual capital case would merit them seeking the death penalty. Courts are unable to proceed on a capital case until the state has advised the defense and the court as to whether or not they choose to pursue the death penalty. There's a lot of things that go into account when it comes to whether or not they choose to pursue the death penalty. As you mentioned, John, forensics take a long time. I have seen DNA evidence take over a year to actually be sent out, to be analyzed, and to get the results back. Now, the trial in and of themselves on the state side, generally speaking, takes a little longer, more so because of the fact that jury selections are different. On the state court side, the murder case that we're in now, that took us probably about 5 hours in court to have that jury selected, impaneled, and sworn. On a death penalty case, the last death penalty jury trial I had probably took about 5 weeks. In fact, the last several death penalty cases that we presided over have taken about 5 weeks, because you got to go through and examine these folks individually about whether or not they can follow the law, because there's so much involved. Yes, that's a great question. I enjoyed answering it. Thank you for asking. Keep asking those questions. Let's head back to the show.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome back. I'm here talking to John. I'm interested in your experience and your background as a prosecutor. It's pretty varied and pretty rich. How does that contribute to the strategies that you have to use when a potential client comes in, tells you, hey, I'm being charged with X in the state or federal system, and they're facing white collar crime cases? What type of store of information from your experiences do you reach into to make sure that you defend some of these individuals that are charged with these crimes?
Well, aside from understanding all we can as far as what the person did, what evidence there may be against them, et cetera, if it's pre-indictment where the person has not been charged and arrested before, which often is the case in these white-collar cases, you'll have some time to get in with the prosecutor, especially at the U.S. Attorney's Office, where you'll learn about something ahead of time. Subpoenas or agents are interviewing people, and the people call the person and go, hey, they're asking about you. You get in so you can at least learn the lay of the land, what's coming at the person, what they're looking at, what they're focusing on. And from there, we can try to gather if there's something to work with, so to speak, or push back with, going, wait a minute, they're grouping me in with these people. I didn't do that, or I didn't know that, to try to get your statements, get your documents, get whatever to show that they may be off base. If it looks like it's got the makings of the case for the government, at least you can see what's coming at the person. Then in the federal system, cooperation is built in more so than the state. So they're used to doing it. And if there's something to trade in to get a reduction, then you can an understanding at least of what that might where that might lead you.
Over the course of time, I've noticed that the codes, the statutes that we use gets thicker and thicker. Books seem to get heavier and heavier. There's a lot of laws that are created, and this is the common law system that we work under, created from Great Britain around the time of the Magna Carta. Common law developed crimes like murder, aggravated sexual assault, robbery, kidnapping, those types of cases. What we're seeing lately is a lot of crimes that the government has created, crimes that are non-traditional legal violations. How would you define the concept of these government-created type crimes?
Well, you do see a lot of those, Judge. You see them, there's different statutes that provide certain agencies with the ability to investigate those and bring them to the U.S. Attorney, such as the ATF, IRS, EPA come to my mind. Say with the ATF, possessing a non-registered firearm, receiving a non-registered firearm, selling firearms without a license, manufacturing firearms without a license. On the IRS side, an example may be failing to filing a false tax return, similar with EPA and some other agencies, failure to do this or filing that or non-registering. So you have a number of those things that I would characterize as, government created or non-traditional kind of crimes. And you see that more, and you may not think of that person as being a criminal or a street crime person, but they may be involved in an investigation or charged with something like that.
A lot of those types of crimes are created by administrative regulations, administrative agencies. You mentioned the IRS, organizations like Social Security. They create these kinds of laws, and they're just as legal, they're just as enforceable as any law created by a legislative body, right? And so you think of crimes of commission, like a murder case, somebody intentionally or knowingly kills another, or you think of a crime of omission, like an IRS type situation where somebody does not file a tax return, somebody doesn't report something. I'm sure there's a lot of instances where individuals find themselves to have unknowingly violated some law that is created by an administrative type agency. What would that be like for you as an attorney to make the argument that, hey, this is an ambiguous law, it's a newly established law? How would you defend somebody who would come in and claim, I didn't know that this law existed?
I think there are a lot of situations throughout the country where people find themselves in an investigation for something just like that. You try to show as much as you can that the person didn't intend to violate the law. He didn't do it intentionally, didn't do it knowingly, had no intent to commit any crimes. I mean, I've used this example before, and I'll use it right now. The thing that comes to my mind as a good example of what we're talking about is I've had cases on this side before, and I've known of cases for quite a while like this, where, say, the ATF is investigating people for sales of weapons without being licensed to do so.
Mhm.
And then a lot of times, sometimes you'll find people who are hobbyists or who are ordering legally obtained parts. You can go get the part. There's no problem in getting it, possessing it, just parts. But then they assemble them into an operable firearm. And then the statute is not clear. There's no bright line that says, well, if you do this many, then you got to go get a license. It just, the statute basically reads, thou shalt not manufacture. So you have a lot of people caught in that kind of a gray area, somewhat in defense of the agency that don't have the direction I think they need to. But then you have people caught up in those investigations and those charges where manufacturing without a license or conspiracy to manufacture without a license. They might have been paid a few bucks to put some parts together for operable firearms, give it to the person who paid them the money, and forget about it until 2 years later when somebody comes knocking at their door.
And it seems like a good equalizer in all of that would be punishment, right? So if you have an individual completely understands the law, completely knows that what they're doing is a violation of that type of an ambiguous or newly created law versus somebody who just doesn't have that kind of experience. Maybe they didn't know. Yes,
Right.
they both would be found guilty by a court, by a jury, but the punishment then should reflect the differences in their culpability.
You're correct. It should. And to some degree, the system is geared or supposed to be geared for that. Sometimes on the U.S. sentencing guidelines, the point system in the federal system for offenses, if you're convicted either by a plea of guilty or at trial, sometimes that doesn't reflect as much as it needs to, the difference in levels of culpability, because theoretically it's supposed to have less of a punishment for those, as you're indicated, who are toward the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak. But yet sometimes they get dinged for things that enhancements of other points added here, other points there. And it sometimes seems unfair when, say, in state court somewhere where the sentencing guidelines don't exist, you could walk in and go, come on, it's a nonviolent deal. He has no criminal history. Give him probation and conditions of probation, and he'll move on with his life.
It seems to me, and I don't know how accurate this is, but the state side would allow for that a little bit more so. In other words, let's say somebody is highly intoxicated. They get behind a vehicle. As a result of that intoxication, they crash into somebody and they kill somebody. That's an intoxication manslaughter. That is a different level of culpability where somebody, let's say, and I've seen a case like this, somebody is susceptible to getting seizures or epileptic. And so they've had a couple of seizures within the last year, get behind a vehicle, have a seizure while they're driving, crash and kill somebody. That person could also be charged with a manslaughter case because it's reckless behavior if they knew that they were at risk of having a seizure while they were driving. But you would think that the intoxicated manslaughter would be a higher punishment, assuming everything else is equal, assuming that their prior history is the same, they both good people, good jobs, take care of their families, etc. Then the person then would have the seizure while they're driving would get a much lesser punishment. And so on the state side, you could reflect those kinds of things. Is there something like that on the federal side that exists?
Aside from the different enhancements or no enhancements on a sentencing guideline point calculations,
So it's all points.
basically no. Now,
Yeah.
of course, you have, say, as an example, in a drug trafficking case, you have the quantity, because the guidelines for drug cases are very quantity driven. The more quantity, the more points. But you also have, was he an organizer, leader of a group? Were there violence used? Was he carrying or using weapons? Things like that. It's more of a situation where you're tabbed or punished if you have this, as opposed to I didn't do this, or I don't have a criminal history. So you have that. It's rarely used, but it's been used from time to time. I've been involved in it on both sides, where you can ask the court for a specific sentence where you're essentially legally circumventing the guidelines because of the circumstances. Now, the U.S. attorney and the defendant have to agree, and those are sometimes done, but that's basically the only exception, and those are rare. And sometimes, to further kind of emphasize what we're talking about, with the sentencing guidelines. If you don't have a criminal history, it doesn't jack you up quicker, higher on your points. If you do, it does. So it's a function really of not getting rewarded if you don't have a criminal history. It's more of a function of you're getting punished and you're being haunted by your criminal history if it's being used against you now.
I know you've practiced in different geographic locations. Early on, you kind of mentioned what that was like. And what kind of nuances or considerations do you have to give when you go into a different area, a different place from the one that you generally practice in?
I think you have to find out a couple of things, really. It's like anywhere, even if it's somewhere here in Texas, it's always good to know what the judge is like, if what his specific courtroom nuances are, but also, generally speaking, how that office, that U.S. Attorney's Office, even though they're operating under the same rules, the same DOJ policies, sometimes the policies may be more stricter in some districts than others, such as what they will accept as far as the parameters of some plea agreement versus not, or does the judge want you to seek permission before you file this, or even if the parties agree and there's a plea agreement, do we have to do some amendment to it? Things like that. There's policies that change from time to time. There's policies within DOJ that have been in place for decades, but still there are those nuances even within the system. It's supposed to be the same.
And there's also nuances, even in the same geographical location. I was given a panel discussion over lunch today, and I was telling the group, look, there are 10 criminal district court judges in Bexar County. Every one of them is different. And I'll give you an example. In the court that I work in, if an attorney just wants to approach, ask about a bond, ask about a motion, that they would like to be heard on, they can just come in. They don't have to wear a coat. They don't have to wear a tie if they're just coming in. Whereas other judges do not want any men to approach without having a coat and tie on. And so the recommendation that I gave is you should keep a list of the preferences and policies of each individual judge. Every court is run by a different person, and their preferences are always different. And so you got to be prepared for that, for those kinds of differences.
As we're talking about this, and I'm thinking, the Marshal Service usually keeps a couple of navy blue jackets that they have in case somebody doesn't have a coat for some reason when they're in court that they have to wear. The other things, requirements might include, you're coming here for this conference and I've set this, have you conferred about this? Have you done that? Did you file this with me to advise me of where we are and give me an update? Whereas everyone may not require that. You're right. That's another example.
Do you have any interesting anecdotes or experiences, anything in court or any type of case that is interesting?
I think of like an oil and gas fraud case I had in the U.S. Attorney's Office that had all kind of money laundering tentacles and threats to former employees and attempts to bribe state officials. That was just kind of a series every day, sort of like an American whatever series for the time of the trial throughout.
You're basically telling me that you were in an Aaron Brockovich movie.
Not exactly. And then you have stuff like seeing people bringing drugs into the country through a corpse of a child to try to hide it, and just stuff on the dark side like that yes. Makes us realize the price that we're all paying for trafficking.
Yes. I have a friend of mine who is in the Navy, and she gave me a story and showed me some photographs of she was out there swimming. She was stationed at Guantanamo Bay and came across a human body part, and actually, immediately called the authorities, and turned out that there was some trafficking in the area and somebody was cut up and thrown overboard. A dangerous lifestyle some of these folks live, huh?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Sometimes you have the people who are on the border, should they be charged, should they not? Or even if it's a good case for the government, it's kind of goes back to what we were saying. They're more of a true white collar person and not a criminal mastermind.
Discretion, right? That's always a big part of prosecutions in state and federal systems.
Yes, sir.
Well, John, are there any other topics that we could explore? Anything else you'd be interested in talking about?
As I said a moment ago, the thing that I see as a trend, one of the trends is the just how computer usage and online usage has facilitated things like identity theft, certain frauds, people being able to do this or do that and not really truly be identified.
Yes, the advent of technology has really raised the specter of the possibility of different crimes, but also it's also, I think, made folks more aware and frankly has caused a lot of fear. Right, we're hit with this 24-hour news cycle where we hear and see all sorts of things happening all the time, and as a result of that, folks are, I think, less aware of the civic side of things, but more aware of maybe some of these adverse effects in our society and in our system. And maybe it can help folks lose trust and lose faith in what it is that we do within the courts.
Well, I think that's true because, it is true that you watch the news and it's the world seems upside down and it's just pretty much negative, negative, negative.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, if somebody wanted to contact you and they had some questions about any of these topics, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, they can always just pull up my name. They should be able to find my website, teakellaw.com, teakellaw.com. I should be there. I'm probably listed, showing up on the phone book. It'll have my phone and email address. So I'd be glad to talk to anybody who's interested.
A couple of weeks ago, I was in a podcast with an Express News editorial board member named Gilbert Garcia. His podcast is entitled Brutal Politics. It's an Express News Politics. If you click on the website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, you could catch a link to it. We talk about the recent public safety plan that we publish here in Bexar County and San Antonio. Had a wonderful opportunity to explain a little bit about some of the topics that we talk about here in the podcast. So I invite everyone out there to listen to that and let me know what you think. Well, John, I've enjoyed talking to you today.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed being here, Judge. I appreciate it, and I thank you for having me on today.
Thank you so much. I know that our listeners are going to gain a lot from this conversation. I certainly have. We really appreciate the listeners that we have. We have listeners in so many different places around the country and frankly around the world. I want to encourage all of you to subscribe, to recommend the podcast to your friends, rate and review these episodes. It gives us a really good idea as to some of the things that you're interested in. Continue to ask those questions. We love answering those questions. We've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks where we are educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.